Well, thanks very much for joining us. I'm Barrie Graham, chairman of the Marines Memorial Foundation in San Francisco. We are a nonprofit veterans organization, and our mission is to honor the legacy of military service. To learn more, please go to our website, marinesmemorial.org. This is part of our Meet the Author series, which we hope to hold in person again back at the club in San Francisco soon. But today we're doing this virtually, and we're a nonpartisan organization, just to make sure we provide different viewpoints, and you'll hear one today, I think. And it's not necessarily the views of the Marines Memorial Club, but our goal is to provide intelligent dialogue. Today we're pleased to have Jonathan Katz, award-winning author, and Jonathan's latest book is Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. And Jonathan, I consider myself a capitalist. I'm also a banker and a Marine. So I found the title fascinating. And we all know about Smedley Butler. When I say that Marines, we're taught about Smedley, 2 medals of honor, but he was a very different character. And spoiler alert, we'll talk about it a little later, was involved in a potential coup against the United States government. But first, I've got to ask you, Jonathan, how did you get interested in this book?
So, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to a great conversation here. I first learned about Smedley Butler in Haiti, where I was the Associated Press correspondent from 2007 until 2011. So when I first moved to Haiti, I read a book, actually a book by a Marine called Written in Blood, which is a very comprehensive history of Haiti. I learned about the US occupation of Haiti, which is something that as an American, I didn't know anything about. Most Americans don't know about it. Haitians very much do. But you know, the United States occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, and did so under the leadership of the Marines. And Butler played a major role in that. In 2010, I was in my house in Port-au-Prince when a 7.0 earthquake ripped through the capital and killed somewhere between 100,000 and 316,000 people. Destroyed my house around me. And when I sat down in the wake of that disaster to write a book about that earthquake, about the response, and just sort of set up how a 7.0 earthquake, which, as someone in San Francisco, like that's a major earthquake, but it's not necessarily a world ender, how that became the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. And that brought me back to the US occupation of Haiti and Smedley Butler. And it was at that time when I was writing that book that I did a little bit of extra research just to sort of flesh out this Butler character. And that was when I found, first of all, that not only had he played a major role in the occupation of Haiti, but he played a major role in the occupations and invasions of basically every, he's a participant in almost every US overseas war or military operation from 1898 until the 1930s. And then I learned about his anti-war writings and his anti-imperialist writings, and as you noted, his whistleblowing of the alleged fascist coup against Franklin Roosevelt. And I was like, this is a fascinating person. Like, how did this happen? Who is this person? And when that book came out, and I was thinking about what my next project was going to be, and I couldn't get this Smedley Butler guy out of my head, and I couldn't get the question out of my head: how did somebody who was twice the recipient of the Medal of Honor, was one of the most lauded, decorated, famous war fighters of his time, how did he then become an anti-war activist? And that set me on a 5-year journey of writing the book. It's been 7 years now from start to finish, and it's how I got involved.
Well, I can tell folks watching, it's clearly a very different book than what you might expect, meaning often we expect a book about a military hero. It's just their story and how they come about. Butler was a very different guy, very unusual. Take us back to the early part of him. I mean, he's a Quaker, where he was born, unusual family background, the father, things that I certainly didn't know before I read the book.
Yeah, so Smedley was he was a kid from the main line of Philadelphia, which for people who aren't familiar with Philadelphia, that was it's the wealthy area. It was one of the first suburbs, and still is pretty much the wealthiest suburbs of Philly. He was a Quaker from a very old Quaker family. His ancestors came from England not long after William Penn, and that initial wave of Quakers founded Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. His father was a congressman, Thomas Stalker Butler. His grandfather, his mother's father, Smedley Darlington, his namesake, was also a congressman. And he was from one of the most prominent families on the main line. I went to Westchester, which is where he was born. And the Darlington name, his mother's family's name, is still all over everything here. And the Quakers, as you know, do not approve of military service. They don't approve of hierarchy. They have their peace testimony. And both of Smedley's grandfathers had actually fought in the Civil War. They were so-called fighting Quakers, and that was something of a special case for Quakers, because some Quakers saw that as an acceptable cause to fight in, because the only thing that they hated more than war was slavery. But by the time so Smedley's born in 1881, he's 16 years old in 1898 when the United States starts to get involved in the Cuban War of Independence against Spain. And the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. And he immediately decides, I want to, in his words, shoulder a rifle and help free little Cuba, is the way that he puts it. And by that point, the Quakers were not on board with that war. They saw it as a war of imperialism. They saw it as a an unacceptable conflict. But at the same time, I think that Butler's Quaker upbringing had sort of led him to the decision to get involved in that war. The Spanish were horrendous colonizers in Cuba. They were doing awful things to the Cuban people. The most notorious is that they invented a policy in that war called reconcentración, which was translated into English language for the first time as concentration camp. So they invented concentration camps to punish and brutalize the Cuban population that were fighting for their own freedom. And while the official Quaker line was that this is a war, wars are bad, don't get involved with this one, I think to a certain extent it was his sort of egalitarian Quaker upbringing and his sort of interest in righting wrongs and fighting imperialism and curing injustice that convinced him to volunteer for the war. He first went to the Army, who told him to get lost. He was very clearly 16 years old, and they didn't have any time for him. But the Marines were at that moment looking for anyone they could get, because it was and I'm telling Marines something I'm sure that they know. But over the course of the 19th century, the Marines hadn't been a primary war fighting force. There are major exceptions, right? The Mexican War, the Halls of Montezuma, Marines fought in the Civil War. But for the most part, in most American conflicts, the Marines were sort of an ancillary force at most. They provided security on ships. If there were port interventions, sometimes the Marines would come ashore. But in 1898, for the first time, the United States is fighting an overseas war. And John D. Long, the Secretary of the Navy, says, well, while the Army is getting their act together and figuring out how to, put guys with guns on ships, because that's something that they have no experience in. They've been fighting wars in North America, basically since their inception. But the Marines, they're the one branch of service that knows how to do this. And so Long taps Robert Huntington to form the 1st Marine Battalion. They load them up on a converted banana boat and send them to Cuba, where they come ashore for the first time in that war at Guantanamo Bay. And they seize Guantanamo Bay and fight the Battle of Cusco well, and other things that I think have passed into Marine lore. They're looking for everybody they can get. And so, the Maud Butler, Smedley's mother, just sort of stands aside as he lies to the Commandant about his age. And the Commandant just kind of smiles and says, all right, sure, if you want in, you're in. And he's actually his very first rank. He's a 2nd lieutenant, which was a perk afforded to the son of a wealthy congressman on Philadelphia's main line in 1898. That was to sort of placate Thomas Butler, his father's concerns, because his father didn't want him to join the Marines either. He thought that he would, become a lawyer and follow him into politics, like him and like his maternal grandfather. But Maud convinces Thomas, like, well, we can get him, you can use your connections, you can get him this junior officer's rank, which will keep him in training longer and sort of, maybe keep him out of the hottest fights at first. So he's actually in the Washington barracks when the 1st Marines go ashore at Guantanamo Bay, but then he deploys there a couple of weeks later, and so his first duty posting is Gitmo, and that's how he becomes a Marine, and he loves it, and it gives him a ton of meaning in his life, and he goes from there and stays in the Corps for as he tallies it, 33 years and 4 months.
So for Marines and actually anyone today who's watching the news, Haiti continues to be in the news, Gitmo, those other areas of Central America that you've mentioned. And yet the period between 1900 and World War II, for many of us, we've either forgotten that history or we never learned it. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Haiti as a proxy for how we've managed, invaded, quote unquote, helped out some of these countries. Talk to us a little bit about, for example, Nicaragua is one of the areas that Butler was very active in, and how he worked with companies like Brown Brothers Harriman and some of the banks and oil companies that today we look askance at how that was managed, but at the time we thought we were doing what was best interest of the United States. Yeah.
So Butler, from Cuba, he goes to the Philippines. He's in the Boxer Rebellion, in the Allied invasion of China. And he also participates in the operation to sever the state of Panama from Colombia for purposes of building the Panama Canal. When in Nicaragua specifically, that story in terms of Butler and kind of the US military's involvement really starts because there's a president named Jose Santos Zelaya, who is sometimes referred to in Nicaragua as having been a dictator. He was president for many years, and the United States was debating between digging the Isthmian Canal through Panama or through Nicaragua. And when the Roosevelt administration decides to go through Panama instead, which unspools a whole bunch of history that is still going on in Panama today, that also changes things in Nicaragua as Zelaya starts retaliating against US businesses and US merchants. And there's a lot of US investment in Central America in general, And Nicaragua was already at that point, a focal point of it. And in part to defend these U.S. businesses, these banks, the mining companies, et cetera, against Zelaya's, his sanctions. They send the Marines. So Butler, at this point, he's moved back to Panama. He's in the Panama Canal Zone. He's heading what's called the Panama Battalion, is what it's nicknamed. Although its most illustrious combat is in Nicaragua throughout this period. So they send the Marines. Zelaya flees, and politics are sort of set on their ear in Nicaragua. And at this point, U.S. policy is also taking a turn. So I mentioned the Philippines, and that's an important part of context for understanding what's happening here. So the United States, as part of the Spanish-American War, we colonize, and that's the only word for it, the Philippines. It's a conquest. It's a bloody war, and 6,000 or so American soldiers die, 20,000 or so Filipino fighters, and the estimates of the Filipino population civilian casualties, both of war and disease, are about 750,000. That's the upper end. And there's a huge anti-war movement, really, that starts in the United States. There's just kind of a general backlash against this war, and it's a horrendous war. And I talk in the book. There are atrocities. We run concentration camps. So the concentration camps that we saw in Cuba, we then turn around and do the same thing in the Philippines. There are a lot of Americans who are speaking out against this. Mark Twain is the most famous among the writers. William Jennings Bryan among politicians. Jane Addams, the founder of social work. And so there's an idea that's like, okay, well, maybe we're not going to do that. Maybe outright colonization and conquest is not the way to go. So William Howard Taft is now in the White House, and he invents this idea that he calls substituting dollars for bullets. This also becomes known, and people might remember from their high school history courses, as dollar diplomacy. And the idea is that instead of outright taking over a country, we will sort of take it over from the back end by taking over its financial system. Two banks, you mentioned them, Brown Brothers, which now becomes Brown Brothers Harriman, and J.W. Seligman and Company, get a charter from the U.S. government to create a National Bank of Nicaragua, which is chartered in Connecticut, and to issue a new currency backed by the gold standard, so essentially backed by the U.S. dollar at that time. And in so doing, we'll control the country, we'll control its customs houses, we'll control its railroads, we'll sort of control it a little bit more on the sly. A lot of Nicaraguans don't particularly like this, and they try to rise up against U.S. control. We install a puppet president who happens to be the accountant for a Pittsburgh mining company, and Adolfo Diaz is his name. And there's another rebellion, and parts of sort of the disbanded Nicaraguan army try to rise up against both our puppet president and his and the Marines, because the Marines are the ones providing him security. And Butler plays a major role in that war. And that war really, the hottest part of that war is 1912. There's a tremendous battle called the Battle of Coyotepe. It's a hill in Nicaragua outside the city of Masaya. Butler, so in this war and in this time in Nicaragua, Butler's own status has changed. So he's been promoted, he's gone through the ranks, and he's now a major. And as a flag officer, for the first time, he's able to make some of his own decisions about where he goes, who he talks to. Like, he's given a fair amount of latitude. And he's able to go through the country and he's able to talk to a lot of different people. And he's able to see, for the first time, he's really talking to people who aren't Marines. He's talking to Nicaraguans, both members of the Nicaraguan elite, many of whom welcome the US intervention because they see themselves as being potential beneficiaries of it. And he's also, meeting, as he calls them, wild people who have wildcat investments, American financiers who are coming in and being like, oh, I'm glad the Marines are here because like I'm trying to do this project. Maybe you can help me out with it. And Butler is not alone in coming to the conclusions that he comes to. So he starts writing his parents. And I was, part of the reason why I was able to really get in Butler's head and understand how much he was thinking was he was a prolific letter writer. And many of those letters have been saved thanks primarily to the Marine Corps archive at Quantico. And, he's talking to his parents. He's like, they say that we're here to put down a revolution or defend a revolution, but there's no revolutionary spirit in this. Like we're just here because, some Americans have some investments and because of the banks. And this is all very clear to him. I mean, among other things, in 1912, when he leads a drive of his troops from Corinto to Managua and then on his way to Granada and eventually the Battle of Coyatepe. And he bivouacs half his Marines in the National Bank of Nicaragua. Like it's very clear. It's very clear what's happening here, right? And he's not the only one who sees it. I mean, other senior military officials, other admirals and officers are seeing the same thing. They're seeing that what's going on here is not really for the benefit of democracy. It's not for the benefit of anybody except the banks and the Taft administration and some mining companies. And it creates a cascade of history that continues to this day. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that in the aftermath of the Battle of Coyatepe, the Marines charge this hill. Butler leads a charge from one side. Joseph Pendleton, who I'm sure people have heard of or at least spent time at Camp Pendleton, charges up the other. They take the hill, and the leader of the Nicaraguan rebels, a guy named Benjamin Zeledon, seems to escape the battle, but is killed immediately thereafter, most likely actually by Nicaraguan federal forces, but they're acting with the Marines. And the body of Zeledon is paraded by the Federales through the towns at the base of the Masaya volcano, and as sort of a warning and a show of force, and be like, look, we got your leader. Your rebellion is over. One of the people who sees this go by is a teenager named Augusto Sandino, who immediately, in his recollection, declares that he will devote the rest of his life to fighting against the Yankee imperialists who have come to Nicaragua in the interests of Wall Street and their Nicaraguan proxies. Sandino, his name may sound familiar to some because his followers were known as the Sandinistas. They fight a bloody further rebellion against the United States, the Marines again. That was the second rebellion in which Chesty Puller first earned his renown. Sandino is assassinated. Those Sandinistas are crushed, and a Nicaraguan dictator, the Somozas, were installed, or they come to power through this client military that actually Butler came up with, the Nicaraguan National Guard, or Guardia Nacional. And at the end of this dictatorship, another group of Nicaraguan rebels, these are actual, these are much more doctrinaire leftists and Marxists, rise up against him. They take the name of the Sandinistas in in tribute to their slain idol, Augusto Sandino. And today, Nicaragua is run by a Sandinista president, Daniel Ortega, who has kind of become a dictator in his own right. And you can sort of trace all those things back to Butler and the Marines in the Battle of Coyotepe. These things, they sound like we're talking about things that happened a long time ago, but they still have effects that are very much being felt today.
Well, there's a string. It's interesting for all of us who served at some point to draw that string from back then through to today. Haiti, for example, in the early 70s, I was in the Marine Corps, and Papa Doc Duvalier died. And lo and behold, the Marines were helping put Baby Doc, his son, also a dictator, into power. I guess because it was in our benefit to have peace in Haiti, if there is such a thing. And then you draw forward to today when you were there. So yes. Haiti and the United States have had a long history together, starting way back to the 1900.
Yeah.
You mentioned China, and Butler, his career is just fascinating. He was all over the world, fighting, being stationed. And today we're seeing China being maybe the major nemesis for the United States in Southeast Asia, militarily, economically. And Butler had a role in what was called the Boxer Rebellion at the time, and I think was in China twice.
Yep. Yeah, so he's there in 1900, and then he comes back as a general in the 1920s, as a brigadier general. So yeah, he in 1900, it actually starts in 1898, but there's a popular rebellion against foreign, it's really against foreign missionaries and sort of foreign imperialists and foreign influence in China. It's not just against Americans, it's against the British and the Germans and the French. And it starts in rural Shandong and Shanxi province. But China at that point was still a monarchy, and the Qing dynasty decides to partner with these rebels. They call themselves Yihe Quan, which means like righteous and harmonious fists. But English speakers, not recognizing Kung Fu, call them boxers, because that's the closest word that they have for what they see them doing. And an international invasion is launched to basically crush this Boxer uprising, and also bring the Chinese state to heel. And it's another extremely bloody war. The Marines are involved. The Marines are sent from the Philippines, where Butler already was. The invading armies not only create a lot of civilian casualties and a lot of damage, but they also go on huge looting sprees. And Butler freely admits, and other Marines who write about their experience, and other Americans at the time, this was all out in the open. It's a thing that people did in war up to that point, memories of looting, of civilian casualties, of these various depredations have stayed with people in China. And the Chinese government, which is no friend of liberty or truth or any of this, right? So I'm not trying to say that they're good for doing this. I'm just trying to explain where they're coming from and how this history gets used for their purposes. They talk about what they call the 100 years of humiliation. They trace in their history sort of the fall of the Qing dynasty to the Opium Wars. Don't let the name fool you. These were wars to force opium into China, really undertaken by the British and the French, but with American help at various points along the way. Because the Chinese didn't want opium in their country. The British had a ton of opium because they grew opium in their colony of India, and they wanted to sell it in China. And that's sort of the beginning of this 100 years. And they trace the end of the 100 years of humiliation to the triumph, as they see it, of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, when they win the Chinese Civil War, whose opening rounds Butler was also there for in the 1920s. And in that 100 years of humiliation, both the things that are happening in the 1920s and also the Boxer Rebellion play a starring and very central role in that story. I went to China. I spent a month there researching this book, just like I spent a month in the Philippines, and I went basically everywhere that the Butler and the Marines of his generation went to try to do this, to understand like how these things were remembered. And everywhere it was, national humiliation. Don't let national humiliation happen again. And the things that are happening there at that moment are, at the moment that I was there in 2017, first of all, China is debuting their first aircraft carrier. And the other thing is that while I'm there, I mean, this is just all coincidence, but like while I'm there, they announced the opening of their first overseas military base in Djibouti, just a very, very short distance, a couple football fields length away from the US base on the Horn of Africa. And I found myself, I go to the university, Shandong University in Shandong province, where the Boxer Rebellion started. And I sit down with some Chinese scholars of the Boxer Rebellion. I start kind of pressing them a little bit. And I'm like, well, you're talking about, American imperialism and British imperialism and Russian imperialism and all of that is, all of that is definitely true, especially in the period that we're talking about. But what about, like, do you see China becoming an imperial power now, right? Like, you're building your navy, you're claiming all this land in the Pacific, you just opened your, first base in Africa. Like, do you from your perspective, like, do you wonder if you might be following what they refer to this moment as the eight power allied force? Is this? I was like, do you feel like you might be following the example in a bad way of the eight power allied force? And they get a little angry at me and tell me that imperialist powers never end up in a good way, and then they cancel lunch that we were supposed to have after this meeting. So that was how that conversation ended. But I mean, these are all very live topics, and I think the reason why it's important to understand it, not only because they're good stories on their own part, in their own right, but I think that it's important to understand, like, what are people like? What are people talking about? Like when there is this emerging great power rivalry between the United States and China, two great powers, fighting over control over the Pacific and spheres of influence and all these other things, right? And it can be very hard to understand, like, when a Chinese person says, like, you imperialists, like, you Americans are so evil. And for a lot of Americans who are not raised on these stories, who are raised in a country that in many cases, at a minimum makes the decision not to teach these stories, if not to actively suppress them entirely, it can be hard to understand. It's like, well, they must be making this up. Like, they must be lying. And it's like, well, they're not. They're talking about real things that really happened. And the question is, once we, if we can sort of like agree on this, on this set of facts, then what do we do with that? Like, how do you, like, is there something you can learn from being on the wrong end of this that will keep you from doing to other people's, what the United States and what other Western powers and Japan did to you? And I think that has a much greater potential for a fruitful conversation that can maybe ultimately avoid conflict, if not lunch. than going into it completely ignorant.
Now, Jonathan, I found it a fascinating study of better understanding what's happening today in our relationships with China, the Philippines, Nicaragua, Central America, Mexico, to go back to that period of time, because we have spent a lot of, the United States, the Marine Corps, the Army has spent a lot of time in those countries, both good and bad, over that period of time. And you draw a direct line in your book to what happened then and how we treated those countries and what our objectives were to what our relationships are today.
Yeah.
And for me, that was certainly maybe the most important part of the book. And for Butler, it seems like after his 33-year career and toward the end of it, he started questioning the goal of fighting in these countries to prevent further bloodshed, or are you doing more damage? And I think we can draw that analogy to what we've done in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. We've sent Marines, soldiers, Navy, Air Force over there with the hope that we're preventing further conflict here. And at least that seemed to be part of what changed Butler's attitude about what he had done. And toward the end of his career, he spent time in San Diego.
Yep.
And an interesting part of the book, those of you who remember Lon Chaney, who's an old-time Hollywood actor who was well-known at the time, did a movie with Butler, The Making of the Marines, and it turned out it was Chaney's most successful movie ever. But the reason I mention it at that point, Butler was the second highest officer in the Marine Corps. So he was being considered for Commandant of the Marine Corps. And tell us a little bit about that period, because he obviously wound up not being Commandant, even though he was second in line, and got himself in trouble with some of the speeches he made about his history, which at the time was unpopular, about Mussolini, Nicaragua, those incidents.
Yeah. So so Butler, throughout the 1920s, he still harbors a dream of becoming Commandant of the Marine Corps. He was very, very close friends with John Lejeune, and wanted to sort of follow in his path. A number of things go wrong for him over the course of this period in terms of that being his goal. One is that his father, who at that point had been the chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee in Congress, so in charge of funding the Marine Corps, dies. Lejeune resigns shortly thereafter. The Marine Corps is changing at that moment. There's much more of an emphasis being put on academy grads, getting into positions of responsibility. Butler, he did end up finishing his high school diploma, but barely, because he basically left high school to fight in the war in Cuba. And he never goes to college, he never goes to the academy. So he's not the profile that the Corps is looking, or really the president is looking for in the late 20s. And also at this moment, so he's in China. He goes from San Diego to China, and he ends up back in the States, and it's now 1929, and he needs money. The Great Depression has hit. He and his wife, Ethel Butler, are building a home on the main line to be, close to Smedley's hometown and his mother. They have bills to pay. The kids are in college, and he goes on the speaking circuit. And Butler learns very quickly that he kind of becomes, honestly, like what you would call these days maybe a troll, or for people of my generation might call him a poster, like somebody who just he finds very quickly that the more attention grabbing a talk that he gives, the more likely it is that he's going to get more talks in the future, right? And so he starts giving speeches, and he starts telling stories, war stories, about the things that he and the Marines were doing overseas. He gives his talk in Pittsburgh, He tells a story about the Marines fixing an election in Nicaragua. He tells a story about his Marines and the client army that Butler creates, the Gendarmerie de Haiti, which kind of becomes the model for everything from the Guardias Nacionales in Latin America to the ARVN in Vietnam to the ANA in Afghanistan. The Marines and the Gendarmerie dissolve a parliament in Haiti at gunpoint. And he tells this story and it gets a lot of attention. And it kind of creates this scandal and he starts getting in trouble. Relations between him and the Hoover administration are also not great. Among other things, it's personal because Butler's Marines, as Littleton Waller was the major, had actually conscripted Hoover, who was an engineer living with his wife Lou in China back in 1900 in the Boxer Rebellion. Herbert Hoover leads the Marines into battle at the Battle of Tianjin and gets Butler shot because he leads them to the wrong place. And Butler does not forget this. And Hoover by this point is president of the United States. And so Butler starts, he gives this talk in Pittsburgh, kind of gets some backlash from the administration. He kind of backs off a little bit, but now he starts to give, attention-getting speeches again. And in 1931, he gives a talk in Philadelphia at a social club about Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. And he tells a story about how Mussolini was driving through the Italian countryside with an American journalist, runs over a child, and the American journalist, gasps and says, Signor Mussolini, I think we hit something back there. And Mussolini says something along the lines of, as Butler recounts it, what is the life of a child in the history of a state? There are other ultimately versions of what he says, but they're all sort of along that same line. Butler actually is making a political point there, and I think a good one, which is the fascist dictators can't be trusted. He's saying this in context. Mussolini at that moment is calling for a disarmament conference, and Butler is saying, we can't trust fascists to say just because they're going to disarm their armies that they're actually planning to do that. And of course, he ends up being correct. But at that moment, the Hoover administration, the United States in general, has good relations with the fascists, with the fascists in Italy. The official position is neutrality toward everybody. And this is very embarrassing for the Hoover administration. And the Italian ambassador lodges an official diplomatic complaint. And the Hoover administration, Charles Adams, the Secretary of the Navy, court-martials Butler. And Butler, in one of, I think, the all-time great trolls. So I mentioned, that Hoover got him shot at the Battle of Tianjin. Butler brings in as his counsel for the court-martial his friend Harry Leonard, who also got shot because of Hoover at the Battle of Tianjin and lost his arm. So he's there, meeting with the Secretary of the Navy with the arm that he lost because of the president. And he ends up, getting the charges dropped against Butler in exchange for an apology to the Secretary of the Navy, but not crucially to Mussolini. Butler never has to say he was sorry to the fascists. And that's basically the end of his Marine Corps career, because at that point, he's look, he's a loudmouth. This is something I very much identify with. He speaks his mind, and he really doesn't care who says it. I also quote in the book, because it's just a great moment. At one point, during this sort of testy lead up to this court martial, I think it actually was before the Mussolini speech, but Charles Adams, the Secretary of the Navy, comes for an inspection toward Quantico, which Butler is the commandant of at the time, and Butler introduces him to his Marines. He says, "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet the Secretary of the goddamn Navy," which is not a good way to get not a good way to be. If your goal is to become commandant, that's not how to do it.
Now, that sealed his fate to not become commandant, I think.
Yeah.
But it also enamored Butler with the troops.
Yes.
Veterans, troopers really admired him. They respected him. And about this time, there was a proposal to pay a bonus to veterans.
Yes.
And Congress considered the bonus. This is just prior to World War II. And there was a bonus march in DC, where again was controversial because the government never passed the bonus. Right. And yet hundreds of veterans gathered in DC in a march, and Butler was one of the speakers.
Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Let me tell you something. I've been all over the world. I've seen you fellas on the streets in Washington. There isn't this well-behaved group of citizens in the world that's sitting right in this camp. I've had to run soldiers. I never saw such discipline. I never saw such fine Americanism as is exhibited by you people. And it's an honor, a privilege to come here and be with you.
And it's interesting that he was also opposed by two, or at least two well-known generals were involved in squelching the bonus march. How did that come about?
Yeah, so yeah, as you know, so in basically in World War I, in exchange for to convince people to submit to the draft, because this is the first major nationwide draft that had happened in decades since the Civil War. The Wilson administration says we'll pay back pay to everybody who gets drafted, but this payment never comes. And there are proposals, and finally a bill is passed in the 1920s to pay what's known as the bonus, but it's really back pay is probably a better term for it. But the deal is that that the veteran can't get it until either the veteran dies or 1945, whichever comes first. And the Depression hits, it's 1932, and these veterans, like a lot of people in the United States, they've lost everything. And they realize that this bonus certificate that they have is the only thing in their lives that's like still holds any value, and they want their money. And they come and they stage, it was actually tens of thousands come from all over the country. They stage an extended sort of occupation, as protest occupation, very nonviolent, in Washington. And they basically set up shanty towns, Hoovervilles, as they were called at the time, one on the National Mall and one on the Anacostia Flats, just across the Anacostia River from the mall, from the center of DC. And the establishment almost uniformly lines up against these guys because they're like, they're just here looking for a handout. They're, maybe they're communist, maybe they're, maybe they're trying to start a revolution. And actually, I went down all these rabbit holes. The communists actually wanted to infiltrate the bonus march, and the bonus marchers didn't care. They told them to get lost. And one of the leaders of the bonus march had very clear fascist sympathies, but most of the bonus marchers weren't listening to him either. They didn't want to overthrow their government. They wanted their government's help. They just wanted benefits, and that's really where you get the GI Bill and the benefits, imperfect and incomplete, and we can talk about those. But as they are today, the fact that they exist at all is really in large part because of memory of this moment. But what happens in 1932 is, so the Senate. Goes into recess for the summer without acting on the bonus bill. The senators, brave guys, escape through the tunnels under the Capitol so they don't have to confront the bonus marchers. And Butler comes out and gives a speech a couple days after the Senate's gone into recess, telling the marchers, like, stay here. He's like, I know the establishment doesn't like you guys, they're calling you tramps, but you deserve this. Who's done more fighting and bleeding for this Constitution than you fellas? That's a direct quote. And a lot of the veterans, take this call seriously. And Butler says, if you leave, if you give up this protest, it'll evaporate in thin air. They'll just pretend like it never happened, and you'll never get what's coming to you. You'll never get the help that you need. And a lot of them take that seriously, and they stay. And what happens is, 9 days after Butler's speech, Hoover, that guy, Hoover, sends in the army. And he sends the army led by the Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, who comes with his adjutant, Major at that time, but future General Dwight Eisenhower. And they embark on what MacArthur euphemistically calls a maneuver. They attack the veterans on the National Mall. They fire chemical weapons. They burn the marchers' shacks to the ground. There's a cavalry charge and a bayonet charge led by Major and future General George Patton, who's at that point a cavalry officer. And there are casualties. And a lot of people are injured. A baby dies. 2 marchers are killed actually at the beginning of this. They're shot by DC police in sort of a thing that happens right at the beginning of this maneuver. MacArthur, he defends it, what he did. He says that, he prevented a communist revolution. Hoover spends the rest of his life making excuses for this and says that, that he and MacArthur absolutely did the right thing. Eisenhower regrets it in his memoirs. He expresses shame for having taken part in this. It's really a disgraceful moment. I mean, you've got active duty soldiers, attacking veterans and killing one of their children because they had the temerity to ask their government, a government that had sent them to war, for help during a crisis. And the results of this, as I say, so the GI Bill is one result. Another result is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who at that point is in the middle of the 1932 campaign for the presidency, and he is saying, we're going to have a real, possible fascist turn in this country, or maybe a communist turn. But like, if there could be a revolution if we don't use the power of the federal government to help people in need. And that convinces him to really, bolster his plans for the New Deal. And for Butler, it's a radicalizing moment. And it's a moment where he sees, because, he sees the way that, these things that, the military that he had done overseas in the Philippines, in Haiti, in Nicaragua, et cetera, these scenes that had taken place elsewhere have now come to the heart of the American democratic system. I mean, literally in the shadow of the Capitol. And he sees the way in which fascism, in which this kind of authoritarian tendency can be used, in which, like, the US military can be used to attack American citizens, veterans. And that's one of the things that really, I think, radicalizes him and convinces him to spend the last decade of his life fighting against war, fighting against imperialism. He writes his book, War is a Racket, which is sort of an early warning of what Eisenhower ultimately calls the military-industrial complex. That moment, the bonus march, it was again, that's another thing that's like, it's a major moment in American history that had huge effects on everything that happened over the course of the rest of the 20th century and since, that Americans don't learn about. because it is not the kind of story that we like to tell about ourselves.
One of the other elements you point out in the book that was certainly shocking to me is about this time. So FDR has been nominated. The Depression is still adversely affecting the United States. The country is neutral, and yet we have expressed positive expression about Mussolini. You've got Hitler is actually even being tolerated within the United States. And Butler is approached by some businessmen who see that as a way of getting strong leadership, even despite giving up liberty, you might say, to get strong leaders in place. And Butler's offered at the time a significant amount of money. And the logic, I guess, is that because he's such a well-known, well-respected leader among the troops, that Butler could lead a coup. And tell us about how that came about. And then Butler obviously testifies in front of Congress.
It starts in 1933. A representative of a Wall Street firm. The firm is GMP Murphy and Company. And it's a bond salesman for the firm, a guy named Gerald C. McGuire, who's a Navy vet, a member of the American Legion, starts approaching Butler and it's not entirely clear at the beginning what he wants. It starts off as sort of this idea that Butler's going to go to an American Legion convention. He's going to give a speech denouncing FDR's decision to take the dollar off the gold standard. And Butler, was like, why would I do that? Like, I don't care about the gold standard, and it doesn't make any sense to me. McGuire's like, oh, but it's for the troops. He's like, how does this help the troops? Like, how does that help the troops? That doesn't make any sense. And but this courtship continues, and over the course of 1934, McGuire starts sending Butler a series of postcards from Italy, where Mussolini's in power. He goes to Hitler's Berlin. He goes to Paris. 6 weeks after, there's actually been a riot of fascist and far right groups, and one group of communists, because you always got to have some, to storm the French Parliament and essentially prevent the transfer of power to a liberal government. And in August 1934, McGuire comes to Butler and he says, we got to meet. And he says, the time has come to get the veterans together. And Butler's like, I think so too. He has no idea what he's talking about. And what he's talking about is his plan is that he wants Butler to lead a column of 500,000 veterans of the First World War, which at that point was the only World War, but of World War I veterans into Washington. And he wants to lead them essentially, up Pennsylvania Avenue, probably to the White House, armed, and to intimidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt into either resigning his office or delegating power to a cabinet secretary who the coup plotters would name. The laws of presidential succession were different at that moment, so it did not necessarily. It didn't seem like John Garner, who was the vice president, was going to be around for much longer, and so the idea was that they would basically pick this cabinet secretary, and that cabinet secretary would then essentially become a dictator. And McGuire says at one point, a fascist dictator. And their idea is what they want to do here is they want to overthrow the New Deal. Their plan is they know that the New Deal is very popular with voters. FDR has won a landslide victory in 1932. It's one of the largest swings from a Republican victory to a Democratic victory in American history, or from one party to another party in American history. And they know that this is not going to, they're not going to be able to defeat this at the ballot box. And so they want to, use the bullet box. And Butler, instead of going along, goes to Congress and tells them everything he knows. He testifies in front of a two-man subcommittee of the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, and Butler tells him everything. We don't know exactly to this day who was behind this plot, other than Gerald McGuire, and almost certainly his boss, Grayson MP Murphy. And one of the reasons why, in my research, I think you can conclude that Murphy almost certainly was behind this, or at least was on board with this to some extent, is because he had a very extensive background in military intelligence. He had been all over the world in these, overseas wars, doing interference from behind the scenes in Panama and in the Philippines. He's in Europe with Wild Bill Donovan, who ends up being the head of the OSS, which is one of the precursor organization to the CIA. He's very closely connected to J.P. Morgan and Company, and he's the treasurer of this group called the Liberty League. And McGuire tells Butler to expect these big financial backers to come forward in the near term. And this is a group that it's an anti-New Deal essentially organization led by some of the biggest names in American industry at the time: the DuPonts, General Motors, General Foods, Phillips Oil, Sun Oil, et cetera, J.P. Morgan. The thing is, I tried to be extremely careful and extremely precise in my research, and say only things that like I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. And if there's any question, I put it out there, if it's responsible and well sourced enough to do so, and say, and this is one of these cases where I'm like, look, Murphy is somebody who clearly knew his way around the planning of a coup. McGuire, testifies, he affirms all of Butler's testimony, and the congressional committee, despite the fact that Butler is mocked in the national press, he's lampooned in the New York Times, he's mocked in Time magazine, et cetera. Despite all of that pressure, the congressional committee is like, look, we can verify all the pertinent statements made by General Butler here. The thing I don't know, because I haven't found evidence of it, is whether there is a clear, paper trail connecting, saying, here is a letter from, Grayson Murphy to, Irene Dupont saying, we're going to do this coup. We need X number of dollars from you, whatever. It's not impossible to imagine, because at this moment, a lot of people, including the DuPonts, think that, the only ways forward in history, that basically liberal democracy is on its way out, and the only ways forward are either going to be communism or fascism. And to a lot of wealthy people in America at that time, fascism was their preferred route, and they had sort of lost faith in democracy themselves. So it is entirely plausible that they would have at least, given sort of their nominal backing to this coup plot. And then, when Butler comes forward and blows the whistle, it makes it impossible for them to do it, because now everybody in the country knows what they're doing. And so, trying to get a bunch of veterans together through the American Legion or whatever that's going to be very, very difficult. Or it's possible that the reason why they express incredulity when approached, with questions about it by, the New York Times, it may be because they actually hadn't heard of it yet, because like Murphy hadn't come to them yet. Who knows? But this is kind of, I think, really like kind of the final radicalizing moment for Butler, because Butler's key insight here, and I think it is a key insight, and I think it's something that people really can learn from today, is that the things that we do abroad don't stay abroad. The wars that we fight and the ways in which we fight these wars. And, look, mistakes happen. I'm thinking about, the drone strikes that the United States has been involved with for the last, 15 years. Like I can't keep track anymore. The drone strike that ended the Afghan war from the American perspective, where we just killed 10 civilians, 7 of them children, right? And no one's going to be held responsible in any way. And I'm not saying like, tar and feather these guys, but like have somebody, like children were killed, like somebody should suffer some consequence somehow, right? It's a dock in pay or something, right? And we broadcast to the world and to our own people that these people don't count, that we can just sort of act with impunity. And what Butler's insight, and an insight that I think we can take from Butler, is that just as this army that had just sort of attacked civilians, then attacked civilian veterans in the bonus march, in that same way, a lot of Americans see, that the lives of others aren't worth as much as our lives, so the lives of the people that we imagine really count. And that a way of dealing with the world is through force and violence, and indefinite detention and torture and all these other things. And at some point, the thought occurs as these wars, draw in, and we're in another period of withdrawal from overseas conflict. At some point, some people start looking at, well, why don't we do these to people at home? And this covers both, people like the rioters on January 6th, who are calling for military tribunals and the arrest and torture and God knows what else of American officials, and also liberals who responded to January 6th and said, well, what we need now is a counterinsurgency at home, where like we treat Americans as insurgents, and like, no, all of that is wrong. All of that is a bad idea, because all of that does is that just enshrines these forms of authoritarianism and violence that we've done to other people, and then we end up just doing them to ourselves. And I think Butler was a very imperfect man, as we are all imperfect people, and he was definitely one of them. And he was blind to a lot of things in his life. To a certain extent, the only reason why this sort of late in life activism, for which he is, I think, rightly celebrated, is possible, is because he had actually done all these horrible things before, and he really did do them. But I think the one thing that he does is he writes Wars of Racket, and he writes these articles where he really calls himself to task, and he says he's not just throwing stones at other people. He says, I was a racketeer for capitalism, which is where the title of my book, Gangsters of Capitalism, comes from. He says, I participated in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics. I, made Haiti and Cuba places for Citibank to do business in. I made sure Standard Oil had its way in China. Looking back on it, I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he ever did was operate in 3 city districts. We Marines operated on 3 continents. And that's a really hard pill for people to swallow. But he was a Marine. He was a Major General. He was twice recipient of the Medal of Honor. And he's saying these things about himself. And having that amount of self-insight and that a capacity for self-criticism is, I think, very, very important. And is what I think that's what separates people who find ways to make democracy work and find ways to bring justice to the world, from people who just double and triple down and say the only solution is more killing, more occupation, and eventually just doing the things to our fellow Americans that we've done to people overseas. And I think that was his real legacy, and it's maybe the ultimate thing that I hope people take from the book.
Well, Jonathan, I encourage people to read the book. You do an excellent job of drawing the analogy between what happened back then and during Butler's time in the Marine Corps and our relationships today with those countries. The other element I found very interesting is you intersperse your own visits to China, to Nicaragua, to Haiti, to the Philippines, not only where you did the research, but you talk about what's happening today in those countries. And it gave me a better understanding of how our relationship today with the Philippines, with China and Haiti was constructed back in those days, early days of Smedley Butler. And he is a very interesting character. He spent the last 10, 15 years of his life campaigning for not sending troops to do our diplomacy and warning us prior to World War II, and then passed away just as the war was starting in 1941. So I encourage everyone to get the book, to read it. You'll learn much more, not only about our history, but what our relationships are today with those countries. And Jonathan, I want to thank you very much for taking the time for visiting with us today.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation from Marines Memorial Association and Foundation. To learn more about the organization, visit marinesmemorial.org.